Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Good evening to everybody who joined us, and thank you very much for coming. It's Monday evening here in Japan, or more like Monday night. And I know that you're in different parts of the world, and we appreciate your time. Again, today we have Dr. Stephen Nagy, and today the topic of the room is who rules in the Indo-Pacific. I believe it is a hot topic because, many people, I believe, have their own version, or their own answer, but today we are going to hear what Stephen has to tell us. And of course, after he finishes, we'll open the room for discussion. So please do not hesitate to come up and talk with us. So Stephen, without any further ado, let's start.
So thanks, Maya. It's great to be back. Sorry about the confusion about the date yesterday. We thought it was today for sure, but I think on the initial announcement it said October 2nd. So thanks very much for your patience, everyone. Yeah, today's discussion is about who rules in the Indo-Pacific, or rather, who makes the rules in the Indo-Pacific. And I think this is a really, really important question. And all of you might have played board games, and you might have had somebody that cheated when you were playing board games, but the board games are probably best played when everybody's playing by the same set of rules. And what's interesting about the same set of rules, if you all agree upon changing those same set of rules, then you can play a different game. So what you'll often see in rhetoric or discussions about the Indo-Pacific is this idea of a rules-based order. And what you'll see is countries like Japan, Australia, the United States, Canada, and other countries that have Indo-Pacific strategies or visions or guidelines talking about the importance of a rules-based order. So the question is, I guess the first part we want to talk about is, what does that mean, rules-based order? Second, who has made the current rules-based order? It's really, really critical for us to think about. And third, where do we go from here? So when we're thinking about this idea of a rules-based order, we're thinking about that the countries within this region, but really globally, are following what we call international law. So agreements such as the United Nations Law of the Seas, which dictates things like how many kilometers away from your shoreline is your territory versus international waters, the kinds of behaviors that we should engage on the high seas, what kinds of communication we should engage in. So international law has been largely negotiated in the post-World War II period through a period of dialogue with many countries, not like-minded countries, not non-like-minded countries, but through the United Nations, these laws have emerged based on dialogue and mostly passed through the United Nations Security Council. So the rules-based order that's often advocated in this region, but really globally, is about everybody using a shared understanding of rules, whether you sign up to those rules or you behave by those rules to negotiate how we think about international affairs. And this is really important. You might be going, what's the difference between signing up to the rules and behaving by the rules? So when we think about, for example, UNCLOS, the United Nations clause for the law of the seas, this particular law says that what international waterways are international, they should be managed internationally, and that they have various sets of ways of solving international disputes on the high seas. So we have countries like Japan and Canada and China that have signed up for the law of this United Nations Law of the Seas. And then we have countries like the United States, yes, the United States, that has not signed up for these laws of the seas. However, what we see is the United States, in terms of practice, in terms of its behavior, it behaves in line with the law, with this particular UNCLOS agreement, but it hasn't signed up. And then we see countries like China, which have agreed and signed up to this law, to the UNCLOS agreement, but they're not behaving in accordance with the agreement that they've signed. So this is a really, really interesting aspect of how we talk about a rules-based order, because we can talk about it in a formal way, a legalistic way that we all sign up for something and we follow those rules, or we behave in accordance to those rules, but we don't officially sign up on it. So the rules-based order that I think we're talking about in this region, but I would say that it applies broadly, is one that focuses on using international law and a common set of rules to negotiate and moderate how we engage in international relations, whether it's on the high seas or on land. It's a common set of rules, and that determines how we, again, engage. Hopefully, it allows for smaller countries to really negotiate or work head-to-head with much larger states because they're following the same set of rules. So that's a really important aspect of the rules-based order that we're talking about. So the next part of today's discussion then, I guess, is thinking about how are we thinking about a rules-based order within this region. Now, we're thinking about in terms of the maritime conduct or the maritime behavior in sea lines of communication, but we're also thinking about it in terms of trade agreements, abidance by intellectual property rights or environmental law or labor law. We're thinking about in terms of protecting intellectual property rights, and we're thinking about it in terms of international agreements. So when we're talking about international agreements, relatively recent one that seems to be broken is the Sino-British agreement in 1984 in Hong Kong, guaranteeing 50 years of a one country, two systems model. So when we're thinking about that rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, we're really thinking about how we can continue to use rules as the arbitrator of how we engage in international relations, so that it's not a might of right approach to how we deal with things. Rather, it is a rules-based process where small, big, and giant countries all have equal power before the law. So is this rules-based order negotiable? Absolutely yes. And we've seen lots of examples of the rules-based order evolving, not in accordance with cooperation with a whole bunch of different kinds of countries, emerging states and developed states. And some really good examples of this is the Paris Climate Accords. The Paris Climate Accords was an agreement amongst most countries of the world to reduce carbon emissions. It was an example of a rules-based order where countries agreed to reduce their carbon emissions over a certain period of time. But this isn't the only agreement that represents a rules-based order. When we think about post 9/11, the terrorist attack against the United States and the World Trade Centers in 2001 in September, what we saw is the adoption of a whole bunch of different financial regulations to monitor and be able to create more transparency about how money is transferred globally so that terrorists could transfer money for violent action. Now, we've also seen some really interesting international cooperation and rules-based order in terms of taxation, where countries as diverse as China, Germany, the United States, and Canada have agreed to basically make our financial system more transparent and more difficult for people to hide their monies overseas. So this is another really interesting example that the rules-based order that we are interested in preserving is not a rules-based order that's calcified or something that doesn't change. Rather, it's a rules-based process that moves forward and evolves through dialogue and consensus. So when we hear countries say, well, the current so-called rules-based order doesn't reflect emerging countries or developing countries or countries with socialist characteristics, this is quite disingenuous. In fact, they've benefited from the rules-based order, but they've been also part and parcel of helping that rules-based order evolve to deal with some of the things that I mentioned, financial reform, taxation reform, climate change, and even sharing intelligence about terrorists. So the current rules-based order that we have really has been built through the collaboration and the cooperation and consensus of many states. So when we talk about, or when some countries say that the current rules-based order is being challenged, what they're basically saying is some countries are not following the current rules-based order, and that they want to change that rules-based order so that their interests are prioritized. Russia is a very good example of this. Their invasion of the Ukraine really is a superb example of issuing international law and the United Nations basic tenets about how we engage in international relations. But we've also seen some examples in the South China Sea, with China issuing the 2016 July Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision against China's claims in the South China Sea. And we've also seen some other examples from China in terms of the 1984 Sino-UK agreement over Hong Kong. So this is creating challenges, and where many countries right now are saying, well, we need to preserve the rules-based order, at least, or how we evolve the system moving forward. However, we have some other countries that say, hey, the rules-based order doesn't represent our interests or the order that we wanted. It was made during a period when we were weak and didn't have a voice, and it needs to be rebuilt, and a new consensus needs to emerge to reflect the interests of emerging states and authoritarian states and states with a different governance background. So that leads to the question of, can the system evolve moving forward? And the answer here is absolutely. And as I mentioned, the Paris Climate Accords, which includes the United States and China, coming to the same table, that it can definitely evolve and create new rules together. The financial regulations that I mentioned, shared approaches to terrorism, these are all really good examples of how the current international system, or the rules-based order that we enjoy for stability, has been created by many countries of different political stripes, political backgrounds, and not necessarily countries that are associated with the West, rather countries that are interested in building stability into the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So in that sense, when we're thinking about the rules-based order and who makes the rules, in reality, the current rules that we enjoy have been made through a process of consensus making with powerful states from all different political stripes, including the United States, China, and Russia, amongst others. And as a result, when we are talking about the so-called rules-based order, I think we should always say and be conscious that the rules that have been made today have been largely made through consensus, cooperation, and dialogue. But we are seeing a couple countries in particular. Iran is one of them, Russia is another one, China is another one, North Korea to a smaller extent, really are trying to reshape our international norms and international law and international institutions so that the current rules-based order that we enjoy slightly changes and reflects their national interests. So that could be on cybersecurity, it could be on trade agreements, it could be on how we negotiate and think about maritime sea lanes of communication. And as they do this, it creates pressures on international institutions, it creates pressures on neighbors, it creates pressures on the regional and global supply chains. And we've seen that with the invasion of Ukraine and supply chains mostly focusing on agriculture and potash and other fertilizers from Russia and Ukraine are not able to get out. So we see that a country that eschews a rules-based order is fundamentally disrupting not only the rules-based order, but the economies that we've developed over the past 40 or 50 years to create supply chains that deliver regular, stable goods to and commodities to markets. This is breaking down. It's breaking down slowly. It's breaking down on a sectoral basis, and it is a major focus of how different countries are thinking about buttressing or strengthening the current rules-based order through trade agreements such as the CTPP, through standard-setting agreements such as the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but also bilateral agreements that we saw between Japan and the United States in terms of a trade minilateral. So there's lots of ways that countries are trying to inculcate a rules-based order within this region, and they're doing this in a way that is trying to abide by this concept of transparency, but also sustainability, environmental sustainability, and importantly, based on a rule of law, a common set of understanding of not only what to do, but how to behave. So I'll stop there, and we can open up the floor to Q&A or questions or shared views about what it means to think about who rules in the Indo-Pacific and who's making the rules in the Indo-Pacific.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. To everybody who is in the room, please join us here. If you feel like, if you can talk, of course. Yes, okay, Lynn, thank you for raising your hand. Hello, how are you today?
Yes, so thank you, Maya. Good evening. Yeah. So, Professor Stephen, I have specific questions about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Because to my understanding, it is a kind of menu where participating countries can choose their areas of cooperation of interest and not necessarily to involve in own areas. So it's quite flexible. So my first question is, to what extent do you think that Southeast Asian countries can engage in the procedures of setting rules for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? And my second question is, with the inclusions of China, do you think there is any real engagement in the framework without China under the table?
Thanks, Lynn. It's good to hear from you. So I think the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has a couple different levels for us to be thinking about. One level, of course, is this idea of standard setting that is meant to shape the standards of how we engage in trade, what we trade, and some of the rules concerning trade moving forward. Now, as you mentioned, it was a pick and choose kind of agreement. So you can be a member of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework without agreeing to join every aspect of its of the agreement, and that is meant to be as inclusive as possible, and it's meant to create a walkway where, as countries develop more, that they'll probably want to adopt some or more of the pillars of the particular strategy. But as you know, Southeast Asia is very heterogeneous. There's lots of different countries, different kinds of countries. There's lots of different levels of development, and there's lots of different interests. And what this means is that they don't speak as one when it comes to trade. They don't speak as one when it comes to how we think about standard setting, and they don't speak as one when we think about governance. And with that, I don't think we can say that Southeast Asia feels this way, but we may be able to say that, let's say, Vietnam feels this way, or Philippines feels this way, or Singapore feels this way, and they may be able to create a critical mass of countries that can jump into different aspects of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I think the Biden administration designed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with that in mind. but also with the reality that they understood that anything more aggressive, such as market access, would be really, really difficult. Now, your question about China, how can we think about China within this context? So I don't think the exclusion of China is a problem for IPEF. And I think that Southeast Asian countries or Pacific Island countries or the current members of IPEF can continue to trade and engage with China. At the same time, they can find opportunities to work within IPEF. Now, it's focusing on standard setting. It's focusing on climate change. It's focusing on clean infrastructure connectivity and decarbonization and trade. If we think about this from China's perspective and its background, there are a lot of areas that they would be interested in participating. The reality is, though, that I think domestically in China, their governance system is moving into a more tightly regulated governance system, and a governance system that's meant to protect the party, a one-party system. And this will create challenges in terms of joining the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but also likely joining the TPP if they were allowed. I think that I just don't think it's going to move forward.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Stephen, you mentioned in your response to Lynn's question that there are lots of different interests and levels of development here in the Indo-Pacific, but what guarantees that the interests of all those interests, different interests, they will be actually fulfilled or met to a certain, let's say, satisfying level? Because we know that there are a lot, there are several big countries here in the region, and they're politically powerful, geopolitically they're powerful too. And then there are the smaller ones that do not have the means, the resources, and the power to actually influence the development and, let's say, also the setting of the rules of this order. So how do you think this can be equalized for every participant or every country here in the region?
So I don't think the opportunity realization can be realized, but in terms of the opportunity, in terms of access, that can be realized. The reality is you have smaller countries, let's say Laos or Cambodia or Brunei, and then you have a giant country like India or China with 1.4 or 1.3 billion people. It's really unreasonable to think that we can equalize their access and the benefits that come from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or any other framework. It's just not going to happen because of this reality. So I think rather than thinking about equal outcome, we're thinking about equal opportunity in terms of how these agreements potentially benefit the participants. Now, what we've seen, and I think Fiji is a really good example, but I think other countries in the Pacific Islands will probably do this as well. But they found ways to use these agreements such that they can get more benefits from the countries like the United States or Japan or Australia that is trying to support these agreements moving forward. And I think that is quite clever, and it's not something unusual. When President Duterte of the Philippines was elected back in 2016, what he did is he didn't eschew the United States, but he certainly didn't tell the Chinese, that he wasn't interested. What he did is that he cleverly courted all the countries so that he could get benefits from many countries. So in this sense, when we're thinking about IPEF, we may not see China join anytime soon, or the TPP, but they may try to use these agreements to benefit their own institutional reforms, or to use these kinds of agreements as a possible way to de-escalate their relationship relationships with regional neighbors. And this is something that I think our Chinese friends have been really good at, is that a carrot and stick approach, is that they may criticize South Korea or Japan or Philippines or Vietnam, but at the same time they reach out and they talk about trade and they talk about mutual benefit.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a fair point indeed, because, yeah, as you said, looking aside, actually, it's really overwhelming to see those differences in, of course, in the size of the economies, the size of the
Yeah,
territories and everything.
it
Yeah.
really is. And I think you take it for granted that Southeast Asia is Southeast Asia. They use one particular, um, you know, we use that word Southeast Asia as quite homogeneously, but in reality, it's very heterogeneous in size, economic development, um, their approach to governance, their commitment to democracy, their commitment to human rights. So I think that you need to really take into consideration the heterogeneity of this region, their economic priorities in terms of trade and development, and their really long-term commitment of not choosing between the United States or China, but rather anchoring the United States into the region as much as possible through trade and through these kinds of economic frameworks, benefiting from their security footprint, but most importantly, their economic and diplomatic engagement, while at the same time doing their best to get the benefits from engagement with the Chinese economy, which has brought tremendous benefit to Southeast Asia and the region broadly. I think Raymond just jumped in, and Raymond is based in Singapore. He might have something to add to this discussion.
Hello, everyone. Good
Hello,
evening.
Raymond. Good evening.
Can you hear me? Okay, just to introduce myself. I actually have a background in international law, public international law. So I have a law degree focused on international law, did some graduate studies as well, but I've not done it in more than a decade. I'm in an entirely different industry. But let me share with you, or let me sort of complement what Stephen has said just now. Okay, international law is it's rooted in power. Who founded the current international order? It's the 5 victors of World War II, who are incidentally veto power holders in the UN Security Council. That's the very heart of the international law order today. Is rooted in power, whether we like it or not. So the West, as in the UK, the US, France in particular, they had a preponderance of power post World War II. That's why a lot of what we see today in international law is designed after or based on their own national interests and the image of what they have of themselves and what they would like for the world. So a good example is what the US or the Western powers have done to Japan and Germany. Basically, they have reformed them top down into the liberal economies that we have today. At the same time, it's very decentralized. It's as Stephen mentioned. It's based on consensus negotiations. It's, how do I say? The U.S. Firstly, the U.S. is not a great example of upholding international law. It has not signed on many international treaties, like for example, the ICC statutes, the International Criminal Court statutes. And the U.S. courts, they have a very strong conviction that the courts, their national sovereignty should trump international law, barring some circumstances, or if the courts actually agree to that in the first place. So national interest stands for a large part of American jurisprudence. So what am I trying to get here? The U.S. can say it would like to have a rules based order. The China also can say it wants to have a rules based order, and superficially at least, these states are actually following international law. You cannot. I don't think it's possible to erase or reverse international law. It's like you have built a city. You cannot say we'll push the city back to how it was like in the Stone Age. It's not possible. The problem is whose rules yes, whose rules, under whose image, for what purpose? Ultimately, as going back to what I said about international law being rooted in power, maybe the unfortunate conclusion is that whichever country has real power, both economic and military, would get to shape international law, no matter whether we like it or not, and no matter whether we like that image of the future world order or not. Another thing is, so international law is not homogeneous; it's extremely heterogeneous. There's the more of the political agencies or treaties. Basically, for example, the ICC is judicial / political. There's also technical, like aviation, environment, etc. There's also, for example, law enforcement. So the more technical aspects, or as Stephen mentioned, the laws of the sea. So the more technical aspects, countries have to follow no matter what, because they are pretty much, they're not shaped by politics, they're shaped by technical specifications. That would continue in the meantime. But how would the political aspect of international law evolve? It would depend on which country has the most power, and how or when, how is that power going to influence or shape international law in its own image? The last thing I want to say is economic development. So we are too fixated on US and China. How about the global South, Africa, like Southeast Asia, India, Latin America, etc. They have their own voices too, and so the current international law order, especially political aspect, is very top down. As I mentioned, the 5 veto power holders basically hold sway, but they are trading more with each other. They are signing more agreements with each other. Aggregate, I think they would actually exercise a lot more power going forward, and they, being if they are cohesive enough, they can actually shape international law in its own image as well, or their own image. So it could be a third arrow or a third aspect of international law, apart from just the Western Bloc and China / Russia. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. I think that you've really touched upon this idea that, it's power that dictates international law, and that we see different countries having different amounts of influence on how we think about international law and the so-called current rules-based order. And I think they're quite selective in how they support or they reject the international order as we see it today. But I think what we see more and more within the so-called Indo-Pacific region is that we're seeing more alignment on the importance of having a shared set of rules of how we govern the maritime domain. So the East China Sea to the Taiwan Strait to the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. And the simple reason is that about 5.5 trillion USD in goods comes in and out of these sea lines of communication, and that the major exporters, China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, they're very reliant on having these sea lanes of communication being stable and governed by a shared understanding of how we manage these sea lanes. But at the same time, we have a U.S.-China relationship that is deteriorating. It's moving in a bad direction, and the Chinese understand that these sea lines of communication are not only an area of opportunity and economic economic prosperity, but they're also a huge liability in terms of the Chinese economy. And if there was a particular incident between China and the United States and its partners would probably block off these sea lines of communication to choke off the Chinese economy. So we have this bipolar duality that the sea lines of communication and their management are critical to all the countries within the region, but they're also a huge vulnerability. And what we see is that many like-minded countries from South Korea to Japan to Philippines, Australia, the United States, and others, as well as political entities such as Taiwan, are really reticent to cede the management of these sea lines of communication to China, both from the standpoint of territorial issues, but also what's the possibility of weaponizing these particular sea lines of communication. And again, at the same time, they all benefit from these open sea lines of communication. So how do you manage this? So this is a really interesting question, but it's worked pretty well since World War II. The United States has been the primary guarantor of security of these sea lines of communication, but we didn't have the China that we have today, and we don't have the international disorder that we have today, where countries like China and Russia would like to revise elements of the international order so that they reflect the interests of their particular political systems.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Okay, what international law is composed of hard law and soft law, like most laws in the world. In short, I won't go into the technical details, but reputation and peer pressure are actually very important factors in international law compliance. And we may say that the international law that's broken down due to the invasion of Ukraine, tensions over Taiwan, but if you look closely, actually even Russia, the main belligerent, and to an extent China, they are still following the norms expected of international law. Not because it's aspirational or they think they are great, but it's again reputation, peer pressure, the need to keep allies, keep their allies together with them. So I would say, yeah, in short, even Russia and China, it's amazing that they are still actually trying to, or at least give a facade of following international norms, international legal norms in their conduct of state power.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. And I also have it's a question that has been in my head for quite a while now, that we have seen very little communication between, let's say, the countries that adhere to the rules of order, let's say, the liberal democracies, and other countries that actually align with those liberal democracies, and countries like China and Russia, and especially in recent months, so that the communication actually has, it seems to have disappeared. And I wonder whether and how this could be overcome, because if there is no communication, then how are we to solve any challenges that are there? And obviously there are a lot of challenges, in fact. So Stephen, you mentioned that the relations between China and the United States are worsening, and that diminishing communication, I believe, is one of the reasons for that.
So Maya, this is a good question. There's lots of different ways to answer this question. So I think using a time frame is really, really important, and then putting Russia and China in different boxes and then putting them in the same box. So in terms of the timeline, in the short to midterm, we have a couple different aspects that are pressuring communication or creating why countries aren't communicating. So in the Russian case, the Russians are waiting for winter to lock in their gains so that they can rebuild some of their military, maybe train people, and then they can begin their military onslaught again in the spring. In the United States, I think many countries are waiting what's going to happen in the midterm elections, because I think this will be a crystal ball in terms of where the Biden administration is going to be in 2024, and as a result, they're positioning themselves. In the Chinese context, of course, there's the 20th Party Congress, and we're waiting for Xi Jinping to be anointed for his third term, and then getting a sense of where he is by looking at the composition of the Standing Committee, the Politburo, and the Central Committee. And depending on what that composition and how many of President Xi's people are in, we'll get a sense of where China's going to go and what it's going to focus on in terms of its domestic policy and its foreign policy. So these are kind of short-term pressure, that short to midterm, that we need to be watching. And nobody wants to do anything before these decisions and these particular periods of time are, I guess, have passed, and they've been able to get a better sense of where the next 2 or 3 years are going to be. So I think those are really important for us to be thinking about. But beyond that period, we're going to see a lot more fluidity, and most likely countries finding more opportunity to communicate on aspects of the rules-based order. But I think that the Russian case is very different than the Chinese case. The Russian place is hardening. They are getting prepared for the long haul. And Russia is not China in terms of its global economic influence, how much it's embedded in the global economy, how much countries trade and depend on the Chinese economy. It's a completely different species. So Russia's response has to be hard and direct, and unfortunately, most likely will continue to pressure and terrorize the Ukrainians. But the Chinese, on the other hand, they depend on international trade. They depend on producing things in China to send abroad and then bring back that capital to develop. There are limits to how long it can maintain a lack of communication and relations that are deteriorating without having severe economic impact. And in this sense, I think that once the party Congress has been decided, and then there's another one in the spring in 2023, once this is decided, and once the U.S. elections are completed, I expect the Chinese to find a way to decelerate or de-escalate the tensions with the United States to a more manageable level so that they can take some pressure off the economy. And then if this is the case, what we're likely going to see is quid pro quo, where perhaps the United States stops overt and public Taiwanese engagement for a de-escalation of the Chinese presence, for example, in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, or cooperation on climate change. We're likely to see a window of some communication. But on core issues for China, such as the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, I think that it's going to be much more difficult for us to see communication open up. Lastly, and I think importantly, when we're thinking about standards and we're thinking about rules, the reality is that China is very much in the minority on some of the rules that it continues to break. If we are treating countries as billiard balls, as equals, and in that case, there's a lot of dissatisfaction globally with Chinese trade behavior. There are real issues that, if dealt with, could probably be pull relations back to a more manageable level. But we don't know. We don't know the direction until those critical junctures that I mentioned have passed.
Yes, I see some of the points, and I agree. I actually agree with most of them. Just basically, we saw that Russia is very important for Europe, and of course, it's not anyway close to the importance of China in terms of global economy, but still, yeah. And anyway, so we're talking about the Indo-Pacific here, so I'm not going to go into a different direction, but also, to me, it looks like, and maybe I misunderstood you. I hope I did. It sounded like your response sounded to me like there is more expectation, for China to take the initiative of de-escalating. But I would say that quite a few people in this region actually believe that the de-escalation should be two-sided. I mean, not only on the part of China, but also on the part of the United States as well. So I don't know how. I hope that I misunderstood you, of course, but just.
I think that there, and there's a scholar called Lau Goldstein that writes a lot about this, and he calls it confidence building spirals,
Mm-hmm.
where let's say the United States does something, and then that China reciprocates and does something, and they build a whole bunch of spirals that help de-escalate and move the relationship in a more positive direction. So, in my response, that I said that the United States probably has to shift some of its positioning on Taiwan to be less in your face about Taiwan and challenging China's version of the One China policy. And I say that very explicitly because I think China's version of the One China policy and the China principle is very different than how the United States, Canada, Australia, France, Japan, and others think about it. So there could be this virtuous cycle of spirals where the United States makes an explicit choice to tone down its public engagements with Taiwan to allow for China to save face, and then China reciprocates by perhaps decreasing the number of drills or the number of circumnavigations of Taiwan, and we build up through a series of spirals to reset the relations. So you're correct. They both have to do something, but who will move first? I think that if I understand what's happening in the Chinese context, it's probably not going to be the Chinese. The United States seem to be trying, but there are a lot of mixed messages, and this is a very sensitive political period in the Chinese context. There may be countries, though, that can do something a little bit different. Japan has tried to take a middle way between these two countries, continues to engage with China through TPP negotiation, through our regional comprehensive economic partnership, membership. So there is engagement, but at the same time, Japan is building its defense capabilities to deal with some of the more proactive aspects of Chinese behavior. So perhaps Japan is translated to help bring these two countries together. In terms of negotiating the rules of the broader Indo-Pacific region, I think that the main things support the current rules-based order, at least being preserved or being negotiated through dialogue so that it can encompass a greater number of countries and their interests. But there are concerns about how far that those negotiations can go, and where China wants to be in relation to a lot of countries that really benefit from the current system.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, for the clarification. Because I believe that Japan and maybe South Korea, they can actually find the middle way and be the mediator between the West and China, because they are the countries that know how the culture here works and how important it is, for the big powers to save face, right? And they need to save face, not so much. When it comes to other countries, but they need to save face when it comes to dealing with their populations and internal affairs. So, yeah, it's
Culture is very different. In the United States, politicians lose face every day, but
yes, exactly. But
in China, they don't lose face, right?
right,
So
yeah,
how do you manage this, right? And I
indeed,
think
yes,
China's counterparts understand this, and so this is interesting. I think Lynn has another question.
yes, Lynn, please
Yes,
go ahead.
so, Professor, I remember that in our previous discussion, we talked about the importance of the rule-based order, and you shared that it aims to curb the power. And here we talk about the U.S., China, and Russia, because they are probably been as the most obvious breakers of the international rules. As we see China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait, and also Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here, could you share more about the role of middle powers like Japan to curb great power from and back to my questions about the Indo-Pacific economic framework. So, do you think that if the U.S. suddenly withdraw from that, like it did from the CPTPP under the Trump administration, do you think that Japan can play the leading role again to keep that framework alive? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think middle powers, and I'm going to include Japan in that. And I know Japan has a sense of necessity to be called a middle power, but how it behaves is as the middle power. Prefers to support the international rules-based system. It prefers diplomacy, and it prefers working with other like-minded countries. This became more difficult under the previous administration in the United States, who was more unorthodox and more transactional. And what we saw is Japan proactively build partnerships through the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, through advocating for the TPP-11, through various infrastructure and connectivity issues, through advocating for the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative, a lot of different advocacy. And that advocacy was meant to push back against what the Japanese would never say was the United States, their closest partner, issuing a rules-based order in some aspects of the relationship. Under the Biden administration, though, it's more orthodox. It's more alliance-focused. It's not so It's not transactional in the same way, and as a result, the proactive insulating and balancing and lobbying and negotiating with the United States to change its position has not been as central to the foreign policy to date. Where are they going to move forward? I think it really depends on the particular issue. As Japan is more aligned with the current administration in Washington's positions on many things, that active lobbying of the United States is less important. Although I do still think that they lobby in a different way, not so much to try and pull the United States in a more positive direction, but to ensure that they're defending Japan. So this is really, really interesting. Where will they be in the future? I think Japan is clearly and will not change its position in terms of its alignment with the United States. It's a comprehensive relationship that's been forged at multi-generational, and this means that it will continue to work with the United States on many different things. Will it try to pull back the United States to the TPP? Yes. Mr. Kishida said that was the priority. Mr. Suga said that was the priority, and Mr. Abe said that was the priority before Mr. Abe died. Will the United States back out from IPEF, and will Japan take over? I don't think the United States will back off from IPEF, and I don't think Japan will take over for a couple reasons. I think the United States has put this on the table. They're procuring money for it, and we see growing alignment with many countries on the Indo-Pacific framework because of its flexibility and inclusivity. And it anchors the United States within the region. Where the TPP-11, it could have anchored the United States in the region if it signed it, but of course the former president decided not to.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Lynn. Raymond, thank you very much for joining us. It looks like we don't have so many questions today, which I don't know. It's interesting. Like usually the discussion takes longer, but Stephen, shall we wrap up the room and prepare for the next one in 2 weeks?
Oh, sure. So again, I think it's important for us to just define what a rules-based order is. And as I said, it's a common set of rules that either you agree to abide to through a legal agreement, or that you behave according to those rules, even though that you don't formally sign something. Is that rules-based order negotiable? Yes, through dialogue and discussion. And where is the rules-based order moving forward? Likely it's moving forward in terms of building more consensus on how we should behave in the areas of trade, the digital economy, but importantly, the maritime domain. And I think that this is a project in works because of the heterogeneity of the region, both in terms of development and political systems, but also being pragmatic about balancing interests and economic interests.
Well, thank you for that. And so, to everybody who is here, our next session is on October the 17th, and then we're going to talk about inclusive development and the Indo-Pacific. So, we're looking forward to having you there again. Please take care, enjoy the beautiful season, and I wish you a good night. Thank you very much. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.